My car broke down at midnight on a lonely highway, and when I called my own son for help, he coldly told me, "Not my problem." That night I felt the deepest kind of abandonment a father could ever experience. But months later, when his life crumbled and he begged me for money, I gave him the same answer. Before I tell you the full story, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss these powerful life lessons. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from right now? The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum of distant insects and the occasional whoosh of a car speeding past on the opposite side of the highway. My own car had coughed, shuddered, and finally given up, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. The dashboard lights flickered weakly before going dark, and the engine refused to start no matter how many times I turned the key. I sat back in the driver's seat, staring at the empty stretch of road ahead, illuminated only by my fading hazard lights. There's something haunting about being alone at midnight on a road that seems endless, where the darkness presses in from every side, and your mind begins to wander into places you'd rather avoid. I tried to breathe steadily, but anxiety crept in. I thought about the stories you hear, breakdowns turning into disasters, strangers stopping with bad intentions, or no one stopping at all. My chest felt tight, not only from the fear of the night, but from the weight of loneliness. There's a kind of loneliness that digs into your soul, and that night, I felt every ounce of it. Still, I told myself, I wasn't truly alone. I had family. I had a son who, no matter what, would surely come if I called. That thought gave me enough courage to reach for my phone. As I scrolled to his number, my mind flickered with memories. The first time I held him as a baby, how small his hand was in mine, the years of watching him grow. I remembered driving him to school, waiting outside soccer practice, staying up nights worrying when he came home late. Surely all of that meant something. Surely blood meant more than the inconveniences of midnight. With a shaky breath, I pressed the call button. The line rang, and with each ring, my hope swelled just a little more. I imagined his voice picking up, the sound of his car starting as he said, "Hang on, Dad, I'm coming." I could almost feel the relief of headlights appearing in my rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness to bring me home. But even as I waited, some uneasy part of me whispered, what if he didn't answer? What if my son, my own flesh and blood, decided I wasn't worth the trouble? I pushed the thought aside, gripping the phone tighter as the ringing continued. I couldn't let myself believe in abandonment, not yet. Because in that moment, on that lonely highway, hope was all I had. The ringing finally stopped, and I heard the click on the other end of the line. My heart lifted. His voice came through, sharp but familiar. "Dad, what's going on? It's late." For a moment, relief washed over me. Just hearing his voice was enough to calm my nerves. I cleared my throat, trying not to sound as shaken as I felt. "Son, my car broke down. I'm stuck out here on the highway, and it's past midnight. I was hoping you could come and give me a ride home." As the words left my mouth, I felt a certain warmth in my chest. There's a trust a father places in his child, the belief that no matter what storms life throws, family will be there to catch you when you fall. I imagined him already slipping on his shoes, grabbing his keys, and telling me not to worry. That's what I expected. That's what I wanted to believe. While I waited for his reply, my mind wandered back through the years, uninvited memories tugging at me. I remembered the mornings when he was little, how I used to wake up before dawn to get ready for work, but always made time to cook him breakfast before school. Pancakes, toast, or even just a bowl of cereal with sliced bananas. Small gestures, but they mattered to me. I thought of the nights when I came home exhausted, yet still sat with him as he did his homework, pretending I wasn't bone-tired just to make sure he never felt alone in his struggles. There were weekends, too, long drives to his soccer matches, sometimes 2 towns away. I'd stand on the sidelines in the cold, my hands shoved in my pockets, cheering as loud as I could even if his team lost. Those were the things I thought about in those few seconds of silence after I asked for his help. How could any of that not mean something? I tightened my grip on the phone, my knuckles pale. My son, the boy I had raised, the man I had tried to guide through life, he would come. He had to. Because if not him, then who? Strangers? Tow trucks that might not even arrive till dawn? Number family was supposed to be the safety net, the one place you never had to beg. But his pause dragged on longer than it should have. His silence was heavy, unsettling. It made my pulse quicken, because silence wasn't what I expected. Silence wasn't family. And in that silence, for the very first time, I felt the faint sting of doubt. The silence stretched long enough to feel like a knife twisting in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak again, to remind him of where I was, but then his voice finally came through. And when it did, it wasn't the reassurance I had been holding out for. It wasn't comfort or concern. It was something else entirely. "Not my problem, Dad." The words landed like a blow, heavy and cruel, cutting through the fragile hope I'd been clinging to. For a second, I couldn't even process them. My mind fought against what I'd just heard, as if maybe I had misunderstood, but before I could respond, he kept talking, his tone almost mocking. "Maybe this is payback. You ever think about that? Payback for being a lousy dad all those years. I guess now you know how it feels." And then, without another word, the line went dead. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The call ended abruptly, the silence around me louder than ever before. My throat tightened, but no sound came out. I felt paralyzed, as if the world had frozen in that exact moment, forcing me to sit with the echo of his cruelty. The hazard lights blinked in the darkness outside, flashing red warnings across the empty road, as though even my car understood the finality of what had just happened. My son, my own flesh and blood, had left me stranded, not just on the side of a highway, but in the deepest sense a man could feel. I wanted to shout, to curse, to demand an explanation, but no one was there to hear me. The night swallowed my pain whole. My hands trembled as I set the phone down on the passenger seat, staring blankly at the dashboard, the engine lifeless, just as I suddenly felt. A father spends years believing that his sacrifices, his struggles, his devotion will always mean something, that when the time comes, your children will stand beside you, just as you stood beside them. But in that single phone call, that belief shattered like glass. The ache in my chest wasn't just fear of being stuck in the dark. It was the unbearable weight of betrayal. And in that instant, a new kind of darkness settled in, one that no headlights could ever cut through. I sat there, in the stillness of the night, abandoned not by strangers, but by my own son. I sat there for a long time, the glow of my hazard lights fading into the void, replaying his words over and over. Maybe this is payback for being a lousy dad. They cut sharper than the cold night air creeping through the cracks of my window. Was that how he really saw me? After everything, was that the legacy I had left behind? Not a father who tried, but a father who failed? The truth is, I wasn't perfect. I never claimed to be. Life had never given me the luxury of perfection. There were bills to pay, shifts that stretched late into the night, moments when exhaustion kept me from being the warm, affectionate father he probably wished for. I missed a school play once because I was working overtime to keep food on the table. I remember the way he looked at me when I got home too late that evening, his costume still on, the program tossed aside. I carried that guilt with me for years. But was that all he remembered? The mistakes? The absences? Did he forget the times I held his hand at the doctor's office, calming his fears with whispered promises that everything would be okay? Did he forget the winter I wore the same torn jacket for 3 years, just so he could have a brand new one to wear to school? Did he forget the countless nights I stayed awake, listening for the sound of his footsteps coming home, only to lecture him in anger, because my worry disguised itself as frustration? I wasn't perfect, but I loved him in every flawed way I knew how. I worked until my hands cracked, until my back ached, because I wanted him to have more than I ever did. If that made me a lousy father in his eyes, then maybe he never truly saw me at all. Sitting there in the dark, I felt torn in two. One part of me whispered that maybe he was right, that maybe I had failed him in ways I couldn't fix. But another part, the part that remembered every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every silent prayer whispered for his future, that part told me he was blind to the truth. And yet, knowing all this didn't soften the wound. It only made it deeper, because even if I had been a lousy father, I was still his father, and no father deserves to be abandoned like that. As the night dragged on, memories I hadn't called upon in years began to surface, each one stinging like salt on an open wound. I saw myself younger, worn thin by long hours at jobs that drained every ounce of energy from me. I remembered the weight of steel in my hands from factory shifts, the smell of oil that clung to my clothes long after I got home, the endless overtime I begged for just so I could keep up with the rent. My hands were always rough, my back always sore, but I told myself it was worth it. Worth it because my son deserved more than the emptiness I grew up with. I remembered the day he outgrew his old bicycle, His friends all had shiny new ones, and I couldn't stand the thought of him feeling left out. I picked up double shifts, working myself sick, until I had enough to surprise him with the very one he had pointed at in the store window. His face lit up that day. He hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack, and in that moment every aching muscle in my body felt worth it. And then there were the winters, harsh, biting, unforgiving winters. I had one jacket, thin at the seams, but I wore it year after year so I could buy him a coat that was thick and warm. I told him I didn't need one, that my old jacket still worked fine. But the truth was, I froze most nights walking home, teeth chattering, hands shoved deep into my pockets, all so he wouldn't have to feel the same cold. School wasn't easy either. Money was always short, but I scraped together what I could to buy him books, to pay for trips, to give him the same chances other kids had. I can still picture myself at the kitchen table late at night, bills spread out in front of me, pen tapping against the paper, as I calculated and recalculated, wondering if we'd make it through another month. Somehow we always did. So when I thought about his words, maybe this is payback for being a lousy dad, it made my chest ache in a way I can't even explain. Was he blind to it all? Did he truly believe I had done nothing for him? Because sitting there in that broken-down car, I couldn't shake one question that burned in my mind. After everything I sacrificed, is this really the thanks I get? The phone lay silent in the passenger seat, the screen black, as if mocking me with its stillness. My son's words echoed louder than the insects outside, louder than the occasional rumble of a truck in the distance. The silence inside the car wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. I pressed my palms into my eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. But even in the darkness, there was no escaping the truth. I had been abandoned, not by a stranger, not by some passing driver, but by my own blood. I forced myself to focus on the practical, though my hands trembled as I scrolled through the contacts in my phone. Eventually, I found the number for a tow service and called. The dispatcher's voice was flat, professional, but to me it sounded like salvation. They promised someone would be there, but it would take at least an hour alone, on this dark stretch of road, exposed and vulnerable. I agreed because I had no other choice. The minutes dragged on like hours. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting headlights to appear, half hoping against reason that my son had changed his mind and was on his way. But the road remained empty, the darkness unbroken. Each time a set of headlights did approach, my heart leapt, only to sink again as the vehicle sped past, indifferent to my hazards flashing in the night. I tried to distract myself, but the mind has a cruel way of circling back to pain. I thought about all the years I spent believing that family was the one thing you could count on, that no matter how harsh life became, no matter how alone the world made you feel, family would show up. And yet here I was, stranded, not just physically, but emotionally, drowning in a loneliness that no tow truck could fix. When the driver finally arrived, his truck's amber lights cut through the darkness, pulling me out of my despair. He hooked up my car without much conversation, just another job to him. But for me, it was more than that. It was a reminder that strangers would sometimes do for money what my own son wouldn't do out of love. That realization stung worse than the cold night air biting through my jacket as I watched him work. By the time I climbed into the tow truck's cab, I felt hollow. The ride back home was quiet, but inside my chest, a storm was raging. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds, but it felt cold, almost mocking. The world outside was alive again, ordinary and calm, yet inside me something had broken that couldn't be repaired with daylight. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, staring at the steam until it vanished, the same way my illusions about family had vanished the night before. Sleep hadn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again, sharp and dismissive. Not my problem. Maybe this is payback. I wanted to be angry, and part of me was furious even. But the anger couldn't drown out the heavier feeling underneath. Doubt. Was he right? Had I truly been a lousy father? Did I fail him so badly that leaving me stranded felt justified in his heart? I thought of all the times I had chosen work over family events, the nights when exhaustion made me snap at him instead of listening. The guilt piled up in my chest like stones, each memory heavier than the last. But then came the counterweight, the memories of sacrifice, of effort, of love expressed not in hugs and soft words, but in sleepless nights and hard labor. I had provided when there was nothing to provide with. I had given him every chance to rise higher than I ever could. Wasn't that fatherhood too? Did he not see that love can come in many forms, some rough around the edges, but no less real? I turned the mug slowly in my hands, watching the last swirl of coffee at the bottom. What hurt most wasn't the words themselves, but the ease with which he spoke them, as if he had been carrying that resentment for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I wondered, had he always seen me through that lens? A failed man, a failed father, or had bitterness twisted his view as he grew older, forgetting the reality of how much I had endured for him? The questions circled endlessly, offering no peace. I wanted to call him, to confront him, to demand he take back what he said. But pride held me back, and maybe, deep down, fear that if I reached out, he would only confirm it. So I sat in silence, trapped between guilt and anger, unsure which one weighed heavier. Time has a cruel way of moving forward, even when your heart stays stuck in the past. Weeks turned into months, and though the sting of that night never left me, life forced me back into routine. My car was repaired, bills still needed paying, and the days continued to march on whether I wanted them to or not. But the wound remained, like a scar that refused to fade. My son, on the other hand, seemed to be living a different life entirely. He was thriving, or at least that's what he wanted the world to believe. His social media overflowed with pictures of expensive dinners, designer clothes, and vacations in places I had only seen on television. He spoke about his business ventures with the pride of a man who thought he had conquered the world, painting himself as untouchable, unstoppable. Whenever we met, his tone carried a sharp edge, as though he were speaking down to me from some imaginary pedestal. He'd flash his watch, a brand that probably cost more than my car, and talk about deals and investments I could barely follow. He never asked how I was doing, never wondered if I needed anything. To him, I was just the tired old man who hadn't accomplished enough, the man who had become irrelevant in his glittering new world. I remember one dinner in particular. He invited me to a fancy restaurant, the kind of place where the menus don't have prices listed because anyone who asks probably can't afford it. I sat across from him, trying to enjoy the meal, but he spent the entire evening boasting about profits, about partners, about the kind of money that seemed unreal to me. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, smirking, and said, "It's funny, Dad. You worked yourself to the bone your whole life and never got anywhere. Me? I've already done more by 30 than you did in your entire lifetime." The words stung, but I swallowed them. I told myself to stay calm, to let it slide. But inside, resentment coiled tighter and tighter. He didn't know, or maybe he didn't care, that every opportunity he had, every advantage he enjoyed, was built on the sacrifices I made. His arrogance blinded him to the truth, and I carried my silence like a stone in my chest. I said nothing that night. I just nodded, smiled faintly, and let him bask in his own glow. But as I walked out of the restaurant, the cold night air hit me with a clarity I couldn't ignore. The son I had raised no longer saw me as a father. He saw me as nothing. As I thought more about it, I realized his arrogance hadn't appeared overnight. The signs had been there for years, like cracks slowly spreading in a wall until one day the whole structure comes crashing down. I remembered when he was a teenager, the way he rolled his eyes whenever I tried to give him advice. Back then, I told myself it was just a phase, that all young men rebel, that in time he'd grow out of it. But looking back, maybe that was the start of the distance between us. I remember one evening when I came home after a grueling double shift, hands blackened with grease, body aching so badly I could barely stand. He was sitting in the living room with friends, laughing, playing video games. I walked past and said, "Son, can you give me a hand bringing in the groceries from the car?" Without even looking at me, he muttered, "Do it yourself. You're the dad. Isn't that your job?" His friends laughed, and I forced a smile to hide the hurt. That night, as I put away the bags alone, I wondered when respect had slipped away. There was another time, during his college years. I had scraped together savings, cutting back on things I needed, so I could help pay his tuition. I handed him the check, proud that I could contribute, even if it wasn't enough to cover everything. He looked at it, shrugged, and said, "This barely makes a dent. Why didn't you try harder when you were younger? Then I wouldn't have to struggle." He didn't see the hours I spent sacrificing, The decades of working jobs no one else wanted, just to be able to hand him anything at all. That comment burned deep, because it wasn't just ungrateful, it was blind. Even holidays carried reminders. Birthdays, Father's Days, they came and went without much more than a half-hearted text. Meanwhile, I watched him buy expensive gifts for his friends, splurge on parties, and post photos of his generosity online. For everyone else, he played the role of the successful, generous man. For me, he spared nothing but disdain. Each of those memories stacked one on top of the other until the weight was unbearable. They were small moments individually, but together they painted a picture of a son who had long forgotten where he came from. And though I told myself to forgive, to be patient, to keep loving him regardless, deep inside I knew, one day, life would remind him of the truths he had buried. Betrayal from a stranger hurts, but betrayal from your own flesh and blood leaves scars you can't erase. It's one thing to be mocked by the world outside, but when the wound is dealt by someone you raised, someone you sacrificed everything for, it cuts deeper than words can describe. That night on the highway, and the many memories that followed, made me realize something I had never wanted to face. Sometimes, family can become the source of your greatest pain. I want to pause here for just a moment and ask you, the one listening to my story, have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to have that trust shattered in the cruelest way? Maybe it wasn't your son or your daughter, but a friend, a partner, or someone you considered family in all but blood. Think about that moment for a second. How did it change you? How did it shape the way you see the people closest to you now? If this story already speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you won't miss the rest of it, because there's more to come. And the lesson here is one you'll want to hear until the end. And while you're here, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're listening from. It always amazes me how stories of family, of love, and of betrayal connect us across countries, languages, and cultures. Because the truth is, betrayal is universal. It doesn't matter if you're in a small town or a big city, if you're rich or poor. When someone you love turns their back on you, the pain is the same. It leaves you questioning everything you're worth, your choices, your sacrifices. That's exactly where I found myself. A father left to wonder if he had done something to deserve the rejection that came so easily from his own son's lips. But here's the thing about life. It doesn't stop moving. The world doesn't pause for you to heal. And while I carried the wound of that night with me, silently bleeding in places no one could see, my son moved forward as if nothing had happened. He laughed, he celebrated, he boasted. His life seemed brighter than ever, while mine sat in the shadow of disappointment. And I didn't know it then, but fate was already at work, waiting for the perfect moment to turn everything upside down. At first glance, my son's life looked untouchable. To everyone on the outside, he was still the man with the sharp suits, the expensive car, and the confidence of someone who believed he could bend the world to his will. But as I watched quietly from the sidelines, I began to notice the cracks. Small at first, barely visible, like hairline fractures in glass. But I had lived long enough to know that once cracks appear, they only grow. It started with whispers conversations I overheard when he thought I wasn't listening. He would talk quickly on the phone, pacing the room, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard before. Deals weren't closing. Partners were pulling out. Clients were demanding things he couldn't deliver. His tone was sharper, more impatient, more desperate. But the moment he saw me looking his way, he straightened up, plastered on a smile, and carried on with his boasting as if nothing was wrong. The flashy lifestyle continued, but it began to feel forced, like a performance he couldn't afford to stop. Dinners in fancy restaurants became less frequent, yet when they happened, he made sure to post them online, clinging to the image of success. His once polished car sat dirty for weeks, a small but telling sign. The watch he used to flaunt so proudly stopped showing up on his wrist. I didn't say anything. I could have asked. I could have offered advice, shared what little wisdom I had gathered from a lifetime of struggle. But I held my tongue, because deep inside, part of me remembered that night on the highway, remembered how quick he was to hang up on me, how easy it was for him to say, "Not my problem." So I let him live his life, or at least the illusion of it. I watched the cracks widen, watched his smile grow tighter, his laughter shorter. I knew what was coming long before he did. I had seen this kind of downfall before, not in business deals or companies, but in people who thought they were untouchable. Pride always comes before the fall, and my son's pride had been towering above everything else for far too long. What I didn't know then was how quickly the cracks would spread, how fast the whole structure of his perfect little world would collapse, and when it did, fate would put me in the very position he once held, the one holding the power to save or to abandon. The signs of trouble grew clearer with each passing week, but if you asked my son, he would never admit it. Pride had built a wall so high around him that not even reality could break through. Instead of pulling back, instead of finding humility and recalculating, he doubled down. He spoke bigger, louder, as if shouting about his success could cover the truth that it was slipping through his fingers. I remember one afternoon we sat together in his office. Papers were scattered across his desk, numbers scrawled in a frenzy that didn't add up, at least not to my eyes. I asked him quietly, "Are you sure everything is all right?" He scoffed, leaned back in his chair and said, "Dad, you wouldn't understand. This is big business. It's about taking risks. People like you work small jobs and play it safe. I'm not you. I don't settle." There it was again, the sharp edge of arrogance, the need to distance himself from me, as though my life's work was something to be ashamed of. What he didn't realize was that real success isn't built on reckless risks and flashy deals. It's built slowly, carefully, with patience and wisdom. But he was too blinded by his own ego to hear any of that. He began taking bigger gambles, investing money he didn't have into ventures that promised quick returns. He signed deals with people whose smiles looked polished but whose eyes revealed nothing but hunger. I could see the wolves circling him, but he couldn't, or maybe he chose not to. He thought himself the predator, when in reality he had already become the prey. I noticed the stress eating away at him, though he tried hard to mask it. Late nights turned into earlier mornings. His once smooth confidence cracked in private moments when he thought no one was watching. He grew irritable, snapping at waiters, at employees, even at me. Still, he kept the mask on for the world, posting smiling photos online, talking louder than ever about the empire he was building. But an empire built on pride and sand can't stand for long. His accounts were bleeding faster than he could plug the holes. Loans piled up. Partners backed away. And though I kept my silence, part of me knew the truth. The boy who once left me stranded on that highway was heading straight into his own kind of darkness, and when it arrived it would be a night even lonelier than mine. It didn't take long before the cracks in his life gave way to a full collapse. The first blow came from his investors, men he had once spoken so highly of, the ones he claimed would take him to the next level. They pulled out suddenly, leaving him scrambling to fill a gap that was too wide for his pride to bridge. I watched from a distance as his confident tone on the phone gave way to frantic pleading, his voice breaking as he tried to convince them to stay. But in the world he had chosen, loyalty was bought with profit. And the moment profit disappeared, so did loyalty. Soon after, the creditors arrived. Not politely, not with patience, but with the cold efficiency of men who wanted their money back and didn't care what they had to break to get it. Letters piled up on his desk, red stamps bleeding across the paper, with words like final notice and immediate payment required. I saw him shove them into drawers, pretending they weren't there, pretending that ignoring them could make them vanish. But debt doesn't vanish. It waits, it grows, and it tightens like a noose. The so-called friends who once filled his table at dinners began to vanish too. The same people who raised their glasses to toast his success now left his calls unanswered. Invitations stopped arriving. The men and women who laughed the loudest at his jokes were nowhere to be found when the bills came due. One by one, they slipped away, until the only voice left echoing in his life was his own. I could see the panic growing in his eyes. The arrogance that once defined him was cracking, replaced by desperation. He tried everything to keep the illusion alive, but illusions don't pay debts. The lifestyle he had built on borrowed money and borrowed pride was crumbling, and no amount of swagger could hold back the avalanche that had already begun. Watching him unravel was strange for me. There was a part of me that still hurt the father inside me, who hated to see his child suffer. But there was another part, the wounded man who remembered that night on the highway. The cold words spoken into the phone before the line went dead. As I watched him drown in his own storm, I couldn't help but see the symmetry. That night, I was stranded in darkness with no one to save me. And now, he was stranded too, not on a highway, but in the ruins of his own pride. The call came on a rainy evening, the kind where thunder growls low in the distance and raindrops tap against the windows like restless fingers. I had just settled into my chair with a worn blanket draped over my shoulders when my phone lit up. His name glowed on the screen. For a moment, I just stared at it, the memory of that night on the highway rushing back so vividly that it almost made my chest ache. I hesitated before answering, my thumb hovering. Part of me wanted to let it ring, to let him taste the silence I had endured. But curiosity, and maybe something deeper, something like habit, pushed me to swipe and lift the phone to my ear. "Dad?" His voice was different this time. Not sharp, not arrogant. It was broken, cracked with a tremor I had never heard before. "Yes, son," I said quietly, waiting. There was a pause, a shaky breath, and then the flood came. "Dad, I need your help. Please. I don't know who else to turn to. The business, it's gone. Everything's falling apart. The creditors, the banks, they're after me. I'm drowning, Dad. Please, please, you have to help me." His words tumbled over each other, frantic and raw. The pride that once dripped from his every sentence had vanished, replaced by desperation so heavy I could almost feel it pressing through the phone. "I just need a loan," he continued, his voice rising. "A little something to get me back on my feet. I know you have some savings. I know you could help me if you wanted to. Please, Dad. You're the only one I can ask. Everyone else is gone. I don't have anyone left." I sat in silence, listening. Every plea, every crack in his voice reminded me of my own voice that night on the highway, trembling as I asked him for help, hoping he would show up. The parallel was so cruelly perfect it almost felt as though fate itself had orchestrated this moment. My son, once so proud, was now the one stranded not on an empty road, but in the wreckage of his own choices. And just like me, he was reaching out for family, clinging to the belief that when the world turns its back, blood will always step forward. But he had forgotten something that I could never forget. I held the phone against my ear, his desperate voice still echoing, and for a long moment I said nothing. My heart pulled in two directions at once. On one side was the father in me, the man who had once held that boy in his arms, who had wiped his tears after nightmares, who had sacrificed until there was nothing left to give. That father wanted to reach out, to protect, to save. No matter how grown a child becomes, a parent never stops feeling that instinct. But on the other side was the man who had sat on the side of the highway in the dead of night, abandoned in his darkest hour. I remembered the chill of that evening, the emptiness of the road, the weight of betrayal pressing so hard against my chest that I could barely breathe. I remembered his words, sharp and merciless, spoken without hesitation. "Not my problem. Maybe this is payback." Those words weren't a mistake. They weren't spoken in anger without thought. They were deliberate, meant to cut, meant to wound. And they had. The scar of them was still fresh, still tender, still bleeding every time I thought about it. I found myself staring out the window as the rain streaked down the glass, blurring the world outside. Was it my duty to forgive, to rise above, to show the strength of compassion? Or was it finally time to let him feel what I had felt, the sting of abandonment, the lesson that life has a way of returning the pain you inflict on others? Inside me, love wrestled with justice. The father wrestled with the man. For years, I had been the one to bend, to give, to excuse. But something about his voice, desperate and pleading, stirred not just sympathy, but also a dark satisfaction I wasn't proud of. Fate had turned the tables. The boy who once mocked my struggles now stood on the edge of ruin, and I alone held the power to decide whether he fell or was saved. I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me, feeling both the weight of his desperation and the echo of my own loneliness on that highway. And as I sat there, torn between two roads, I realized that whichever path I chose would define not only him, but me. Because sometimes revenge isn't about hate, it's about balance. As he spoke on the other end of the line, his voice cracked and stumbled through desperation, but my mind wasn't really in the present. It had already drifted back to that night on the highway, when the world felt colder than it ever had before. The memory was vivid, as though it had been branded into me, the faint flicker of hazard lights, the empty stretch of asphalt, the endless silence after the call ended. And then, clearest of all, his voice, sharp, careless, cutting straight through me. "Not my problem, Dad. Maybe this is payback for being a lousy father." Those words repeated themselves now, echoing in my head louder than his pleas for help. It was strange, the more he begged me tonight, the louder that old memory grew, drowning out the present until it was all I could hear. I remembered how my hands trembled on the steering wheel that night, how my throat tightened as I tried to swallow the sting of rejection. I remembered the way my chest ached with a pain deeper than fear, deeper than loneliness. It was the pain of realizing that the one person I thought I could count on had turned his back without hesitation. I remembered the tears I refused to let fall, because even in that moment of betrayal, pride kept me silent. Now, as his voice broke through the line, pleading for mercy, I felt that same ache return, but this time, it carried something else with it. Clarity, a sense of balance. He had handed me abandonment that night, a wound so sharp it had taken months to even begin to scar. And here he was, standing in the exact place he had left me, stranded, desperate, reaching out for the hand of family. I could almost see the irony painted in cruel strokes across the canvas of fate. He thought this call would remind me of my duty as a father, but instead, it reminded me of my own pain, my own night of darkness, and the lesson I had learned the hard way. When you tell someone you love, "Not my problem," you break something that can never fully be repaired. So as his pleas grew louder, the decision inside me grew quieter, calmer, certain. I knew what I had to say. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, long enough that I knew he could feel the weight of it pressing against him. On the other end, I heard him swallow, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Dad, please, say something." And that was when I spoke, slowly, calmly, with none of the desperation I had felt that night on the highway. "Not my problem." The line went still. I could almost hear his breath catch in his throat. Before he could respond, I added, "Maybe this is payback." For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of rain pattering against my window and the faint crackle of the line between us. Then I heard him gasp, a broken sound that seemed to carry all the disbelief, all the shock of a man who had never imagined hearing those words thrown back at him. "Dad, no, you can't." His voice cracked, frantic. "Please, I didn't mean it that way, not back then. I was angry. I didn't." But I cut him off. "I begged you once. Do you remember? On that highway. I asked you for help, and you laughed. You told me I wasn't your problem. You left me there, stranded and alone. You thought those words wouldn't come back to you someday, but life doesn't work like that, son. You planted them. Now you're hearing them again." His pleas tumbled out faster now, desperate and wild. But I had already made my decision. I wasn't angry in that moment, not even bitter. I was calm, almost too calm, because what I had said wasn't about vengeance for the sake of vengeance. It was about balance, about showing him the mirror he had forced me to look into. "Dad, please," he shouted. "I'm your son. You can't just walk away from me like this." I closed my eyes, a heaviness pressing down on me, but my voice stayed firm. "I already did once, remember? Or rather, you did. I'm only giving you back what you gave me." Before he could answer, I ended the call. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was full of every unspoken word, every wound reopened, every lesson finally returned to its rightful place. And for the first time since that night on the highway, I felt a strange sense of peace. The days after that call passed in heavy silence. My phone stayed on the table, unmoved, though a part of me half expected it to light up again with his number. It never did. Perhaps he realized there was nothing left to say, or perhaps he finally understood the meaning of my silence. Either way, I knew the moment had marked a turning point, one that neither of us could step back from. News of his downfall traveled quickly. People who once bragged about knowing him now whispered behind closed doors, shaking their heads at the cautionary tale his life had become. His business filings appeared in the paper's bankruptcy. Everything he had boasted about, everything he had built his pride upon, had crumbled to dust. His car, once polished and gleaming, sat parked on the side of the street with a for sale sign taped to the windshield. The grand apartment he flaunted online was emptied, the locks changed, his belongings scattered and repossessed. I watched it all quietly, from the distance of someone who had nothing to do with the collapse, but carried the weight of it all the same. There was no joy in seeing him fall, no celebration in watching his empire collapse. If anything, there was a strange hollowness inside me, a mix of sorrow and grim satisfaction. The father in me hurt to see my son broken. The man in me knew he had finally learned what it meant to be abandoned. One evening, I passed by him without meaning to. He was sitting on a bench outside a closed cafe, his head buried in his hands, his once flawless suit wrinkled and soaked in sweat. He didn't see me, or maybe he chose not to. For a moment, I froze, torn between walking over to him or keeping my distance. My chest ached with the memory of that night, me stranded in my own darkness. Him turning his back with those 4 cruel words. My son had given me abandonment once, and now life had handed it back to him. And though it hurt me to leave him sitting there, I knew it wasn't my role to save him anymore. In the quiet that followed, I found myself sitting alone more often, staring into the distance, and asking questions that had no easy answers. Had I done the right thing? Or had I simply let pain dictate my choices? For a father to turn his back on his child, no matter how grown that child is, it feels like a violation of something sacred. Yet, at the same time, I couldn't forget the raw wound of that night on the highway, the sharp dismissal that had cut me to the bone. Was it justice? Or was it cruelty wearing the mask of justice? I thought about forgiveness, how people speak of it as though it's a switch you can flip, a choice you make once and carry forever. But forgiveness is heavier than that. It's a burden, and sometimes it feels impossible to lift when the wound is still bleeding. I wondered if, by denying him help, I had only repeated the cycle, that maybe one day he would look back and see me the same way I had seen him, cold, unfeeling, unwilling to show compassion when it was most needed. And yet, wasn't that the point? To make him understand? To show him the mirror, so he could finally see the reflection of his own choices? I didn't wish him destruction. I didn't hope for his ruin. What I wanted was for him to grasp the weight of his words, to finally recognize that abandonment leaves scars deeper than most wounds. Still, the ache in my chest refused to quiet. I remembered the boy he used to be, the little hands that once reached for mine, the laughter that used to fill the house, the joy on his face when I gave him that new bicycle. How could the same boy grow into a man who would laugh at his father's desperation? And how could I, the man who loved him through every sacrifice, find it in myself to deliver the same pain back to him? The truth is, I don't know if I was right or wrong. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe life doesn't divide so neatly into good and bad, right and wrong. Sometimes it's just survival. Sometimes it's about balance. And sometimes it's about finally letting someone taste the bitterness they once fed to you. In the weeks that followed, I came to understand something important. Revenge, if that's what you want to call it, isn't sweet. It doesn't fill the emptiness left by betrayal. It doesn't bring back the trust that was broken. Nor does it erase the memories of nights spent alone in the dark. No, revenge is not a feast. It is a mirror one that forces someone to look into their own actions and see them reflected back, unflinching and unforgiving. When I told my son, not my problem, it wasn't out of hatred. It wasn't because I wanted him to fall, or because I wanted to laugh at his pain. It was because those were the exact words he had once given me, and some lessons can only be taught by letting someone live the consequences of their own choices. He needed to feel what I had felt, not because I wished him harm, but because I hoped that in that emptiness, he would finally understand the weight of abandonment. I stopped torturing myself with questions of right or wrong. Life isn't so simple. What I did wasn't about punishment. It was about balance. The universe has a way of correcting itself, of evening out debts. And that night on the highway, my son had written a debt, in words so sharp they never left me. When his call came months later, I wasn't the judge or the executioner. I was simply the reflection. There's a quiet acceptance that comes when you stop carrying the burden of someone else's choices. I had spent years bending, forgiving, sacrificing, and swallowing pain. But in that one moment, I finally let go. I let him carry the weight he had once placed on me. And though it hurt, though a part of me still ached to reach out, another part of me, the part that remembered sitting abandoned on that road, finally felt peace. My choice didn't make me proud, but it made me honest. Honest about what I had endured. Honest about the scars I carried. And honest about the fact that love, no matter how deep, cannot survive without respect. In the end, my son had shown me who he was that night. And all I had done was show him the mirror. Life has a way of teaching us lessons in the harshest ways. That night on the highway, I learned what it feels like to be abandoned by someone you trust the most. Months later, when the roles reversed, my son learned the same lesson, that abandonment leaves scars deeper than money can heal, deeper than pride can cover. Do I regret it? A part of me does. I am a father, and no matter what, a father's heart never stops aching for his child. But another part of me knows this. If I had bailed him out, if I had rushed in to save him, he never would have faced the truth of his own cruelty. He never would have understood the weight of the words he once threw at me so easily. Not my problem. I didn't take joy in saying those words back to him, but I took truth from it. The truth that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. The truth that love cannot survive when it's one-sided, when sacrifice flows in only one direction. And most of all, the truth that actions always come back, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, when you least expect it, the echoes of your choices will find you again. So here I sit, not as a man celebrating revenge, but as a man who understands balance. My son's downfall wasn't my doing. It was his. All I did was refuse to shield him from the lesson life had already decided to teach. And maybe, in time, he will rise from it wiser, humbler, with eyes that finally see the sacrifices that once went unnoticed. Maybe. Or maybe not. That part is no longer in my hands. But now, I want to turn to you, the one listening. If you were in my place sitting in the dark on that highway, hearing your own child abandon you with laughter in his voice, and then later hearing that same child beg for help, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven? Would you have saved him? Or would you have let him taste the same bitterness he fed you? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Because stories like this are not just mine, they belong to all of us, shaped by the families we come from and the scars we carry. And before you go, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Sometimes revenge isn't about anger. Sometimes it's about balance. And sometimes it's the only way to teach a lesson that words alone never could.